He was just extradited to the United States on Saturday, where he was received in a federal prison in Miami. U.S. prosecutors are charging him with money laundering for the Suns cartel and helping a rogue regime evade sanctions. That rogue regime claims that this Colombian businessman is a diplomat for their government, who's been kidnapped and is a political prisoner in the United States. Who is Alex Saab? Today on Venezuela Explained, we explore both the man and the myth as we try to separate the allegations from the facts. Alex Saab was born in a working-class neighborhood in Barranquilla, Colombia in 1971. Like many Latin American leftists, he has a weird love-hate relationship with the U.S. He was raised with an anti-American indoctrination by his Lebanese father, whose worldview was shaped by two noteworthy experiences. The first was the Lebanese Civil War in the 1970s, in which he witnessed an Israeli-backed militia execute a group of Palestinian children. It was no secret that the U.S. was the main power behind the State of Israel. Second, after he fled Lebanon and became a Colombian citizen, Luis Saab was approached by the DEA, who were convinced that some of his cousins in Florida were involved in a Colombian drug trafficking ring, and the U.S. government wanted to recruit him as an informant. This was something he flat out refused. And although Alex Saab grew up hearing these stories over and over, like so many other Latin Americans, regardless of political leanings, there is no greater place one can aspire to live than in Miami. It's the undisputed cultural capital of Latin America, with all the first world benefits of living in the United States. Hence, Saab's worldview, like his eventual Venezuelan socialist patrons, was one that resented the US government and Anglo-American power structure, but which admired and longed for the security and standard of living that came with the empire. Alex Saab owned a textile factory and was a struggling businessman up through his late 30s. According to his biographer, although Saab long dreamed of making that multi-million-dollar dream deal, his idea of a good month was being able to keep the lights on and the creditors off his back. He moved to Miami-Dade County and registered his first corporation in 1995. However, 2 years into his stay, his and his wife's visas were suspended on suspicion of drug trafficking and money laundering. They were forced to go back to Colombia, while Alex kept trying different business ideas that never seemed to pan out. In 2009, the banks came knocking. His business accounts were closed, his credit cards deactivated, and they even took his newly built dream house. After that, the marriage failed, and their 3 children stayed with Saab's wife Cynthia while he desperately sought to reinvent himself. That was when a close friend of Alex's offered to introduce him to a lawyer who did very well for himself in contract work with the Venezuelan government. That lawyer's name was Alvaro Pulido, and he became Saab's longtime business partner in doing the Venezuelan government's financial dirty work. Fun fact, Alvaro Pulido is not Alvaro Pulido's real name. His original name was Germán Enrique Rubio Salas, and when he met Saab, he had just finished serving time in a Colombian prison for setting up a drug trafficking ring between Colombia and Eastern Europe, stashing cocaine and various Colombian food exports bound for the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, and other nearby countries. He was let out of prison in 2007 when a judge ruled that the prosecutor had failed to file all the required documentation in taking the prosecution to court, and therefore Rubio's due process had been violated. After he got out of prison, Rubio stole the identity of a Colombian man named Alvaro Pulido Vargas, who had died in Miami in 2005. The pseudo Alvaro Pulido introduced his new friend, the struggling businessman Alex Saab, to some of Colombia and Venezuela's most prominent leftist politicians. This was hilarious since independent, non-communist Colombian drug traffickers tend to be right-wingers, and Pulido had a reputation for right-wing political views, yet he ended up in bed with the revolutionary socialists, since ultimately the Friends of Cuba were good for business. According to Univision journalist Gerardo Reyes in his book Alex Saab, The Truth About the Entrepreneur Who Became a Multimillionaire in Maduro's Shadow, the person who introduced Saab to Nicolas Maduro, who at the time was the foreign minister of Venezuela, was Colombian Senator Piedad Córdoba. The story of that meeting is quite interesting. On the night the Colombian businessman met future Venezuelan president and future presidential usurper Nicolas Maduro, it was around 1:30 a.m. in Caracas, and the situation was tense. Even though Saab is ethnically Lebanese, for some reason, the leftist Colombian Senator Cordoba first presented him to Maduro as Palestinian. Maduro turned to the Lebanese Colombian businessman and said, "Take good care of this woman. She'll be the next president of Colombia." Cordoba was also deeply agitated at the turn of events against her at the time. She had just been kicked out of her Senate seat for having active connections with the FARC guerrillas. That's no hearsay. She literally appeared on TV multiple times with the guerrillas along with delegates from the Venezuelan government. The thing about being a senator is that maintaining friendships with members of terrorist groups actively trying to overthrow your government is kind of an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Cordoba was also paranoid that Colombian President Alvaro Uribe was trying to have her assassinated, so she insisted to Maduro in that meeting that the Venezuelan government send armored cars to Colombia for her and her daughter. There's a lot to unpack right there. The fact that Cordoba made the pseudo Alvaro Pulido her personal lawyer, and Alex Saab her personal procurer of goods and services, for political affairs as well as personal business, speaks volumes about the extent of shadiness that Cordoba was involved in. Literally, according to interviews his biographer had with former employees, Saab often traveled with Cordoba and even lived on the same floor of her in her hotels to always be ready and near. Also, it's an undisputed fact that she was and still is deeply connected to the FARC guerrillas. In addition, her ability to just go to Caracas, meet with the foreign minister, and request armored vehicles for herself and her family, at the same time that President Hugo Chavez was being seen in public with Colombian guerrilla leaders, shows how deeply invested the Venezuelan government was in the personal affairs of some of Colombia's most dangerous terrorists, drug traffickers, and subversive political leaders, with the lines between the three being blurred most of the time.
Alex Saab, representante legal de Fondo Global de Construcción, por Venezuela Ricardo Menéndez, ministro del Poder Popular de Industrias.
Saab made money working with politicians on both sides of the border, but he made his fortune as the procurer of food supplies for the Venezuelan government's CLAP food program, which bought food supplies wholesale in order to put a box of healthy, non-perishable foods in the homes of poor families. That's how the CLAP worked in theory. In reality, Saab bought massive quantities of cheap, low-price, and low-quality food items from abroad, often near or past their expiration date, and he billed the Venezuelan government top dollar for the imports. The food provided little nutritional value, and the expired foods often made people sick. By the time the program was implemented nationwide and Saab was the designated procurer for Maduro's regime, the national militia was in charge of the CLAP program, and the food boxes were only going to families who had showed up to vote for the United Socialist Party and who'd also been roped into some kind of volunteer work for the revolution under the threat of losing the food subsidy. Saab also made the most of his new fortune to magically appear more attractive to the young, beautiful Italian actress Camilla Fabri, who was half his age and, without his fortune, would have been way above his league. As soon as they were married, Saab immediately started buying properties and opening shell corporations in Italy to park hundreds of millions of dollars in Venezuelan money into European banks. Fabri initially caught the government's attention when she was spending over 5,000 euros a month on living expenses despite declaring an income of 1,800 euro a month, and going on large shopping sprees with high-limit credit cards. This led to the Italian government seizing Saab's properties and freezing his assets in Italy, while his wife, who's listed as the owner of these assets, is investigated for money laundering. Alex Saab's absolute peak came in 2019, when the US and 59 other countries recognized the interim government of Venezuela, and the US and EU placed heavy sanctions on the Bolivarian government and against individual members of Maduro's usurper regime. This was the regime's life or death struggle. According to Maduro, plus the Cuban government, plus the Kremlin, plus the Chinese Communist Party, Alex Saab was a legitimate businessman, and everything he did for the Venezuelan government was on the up and up. According to the US Department of Justice and the Treasury, plus the Colombian government, plus the Italian government, and the EU, Saab used his massive empire of shell companies, frontmen owners, secret bank accounts, and real estate holdings to launder hundreds of millions of dollars for the Maduro regime to help the regime evade US and European sanctions. Saab was unexpectedly arrested in June of 2020 on a stopover in Cape Verde off the coast of West Africa to refuel his charter jet. The DEA made the arrest, but Saab still had to be processed by the Cape Verdean Justice Department. This began a 16-month-long legal odyssey where the Maduro regime played every card and exhausted every possible resource to keep Saab from being extradited to the United States. They spent over $170 million on lawyers and legal processes in different countries and even in international jurisdictions. They even went so far as to give the Colombian businessman Venezuelan citizenship, legal status as a Venezuelan diplomat, and even named him to the Chavista delegation in the fake dialogue with the phony opposition in Mexico City, all after he was arrested and set to be extradited.
Por Colombia, Alex Saab, representante legal de Fondo Global de Construcciones.
The day after he was extradited to the US, the regime held a Free Alex Saab rally in Caracas. Since his arrest, his wife and small children have effectively been held hostage by the regime in Caracas as motivation for him to keep his mouth shut while they fight the extradition. At the rally on October 17th, Fabri earned herself an Academy Award with crocodile tears and protests that her husband was a diplomat on a humanitarian mission who was kidnapped, tortured, deprived of food, and was being held as a political prisoner in the United States. Given that the regime has his family, American prosecutors will have to work hard and will have to make one hell of a deal to get him to talk. But then again, he's almost 50 years old. With the charges he has, he might die in prison before getting to see his family anyhow. So, really, who knows? Despite the claims of torture by his wife, his defense attorneys, the Maduro regime, and Saab himself, in his court appearance in Miami on Monday, the video of which was leaked and went viral, but is technically illegal for me to show you, Saab showed no signs of torture whatsoever. In contrast, the Venezuelan political prisoner, Captain Rafael Acosta Arevalo, who really had been tortured, showed obvious signs of extreme physical abuse when dragged into the courtroom in Caracas, unable to walk, barely able to say his name, and barely able to whisper help to the public defender before he literally died later that night. In contrast, Alex Saab had no trouble walking or taking a seat, had no visible marks on his body, and had no problem saying his name in a normal voice. He was denied bail but has another court date in 2 weeks, while the prosecutors and the court figure out whether he really does have diplomatic immunity as the Maduro regime says. One interesting detail that's sure to cause some massive fallout for the people passing as the Venezuelan opposition is that in October of 2019, the interim government's comptroller's office issued a letter of good conduct on Saab's behalf, affirming that all his business transactions on behalf of the Venezuelan government were clean and legitimate. This letter of good conduct was signed by Assemblyman Freddy Superlano of Juan Guaido's party. The interim president's own government and his colleagues from his own political party were vouching for one of Chavismo's top money launderers. But the spinelessness and corruption of Freddy Superlano and the interim government goes even further than that. In February of 2019, Freddy Superlano and his personal assistant allegedly used international humanitarian aid money to party, drink, do cocaine, and hire prostitutes for themselves. The 2 sex workers that they took back to their hotel room in Cucuta turned out to be agents from the Maduro regime's military counterintelligence, and they poisoned the opposition politician and his assistant Carlos Salinas. Salinas died, while Superlano himself ended up in the hospital. Only 8 months later, in that very same year, the same Superlano signed a letter of good conduct for the money launderer of the very regime that tried to kill him and succeeded in murdering his friend Carlos Salinas. And if they had succeeded, Freddy Superlano would not have been the only opposition politician assassinated by the Maduro regime since Juan Guaido became president. Yet despite the regime assassinating multiple opposition politicians, not to mention hundreds, if not thousands, of opposition activists, the so-called opposition still insists on going to elections with the usurper regime. And this little gem is just one of many, many reasons why I continue to say that Guaido and the interim government were false opposition from the very beginning. Thank you for watching Venezuela Explained. If you haven't already done so, please hit like and subscribe.
Gracias. Con la misma cobardía le impedían que entrara la comida a su casa, que le impedían que entrara su equipo médico, el equipo médico a revisarlo y a los abogados. Le quitaron todo le quitaron. Y lo que más le molesta a Estados Unidos, lo que más le molesta es que mi esposo Alex Saab jamás se doblegará, jamás. Y nosotros somos y siempre hemos sido una familia muy unida. Y como él está secuestrado, nosotros también lo estamos como familia. Pero como él seguiremos en la valentía, en la tranquilidad y en las luchas por los pueblos dignos del mundo, por Venezuela y por el gobierno legítimo de Nicolás Maduro.